Hi, welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So why do good people do bad things? What drives epic ethical failure in organizations? Have you ever read about a corporate scandal in the news and thought that next time it could be you and your organization? Probably not, but we all tend to believe that bad things are done by bad people. And since we consider ourselves to be decent human beings, we don't believe we ever engage in similar behavior. And yet most of the time, it's people like you and me who push organizations over the ethical edge. Now, there's one man who's committed himself to understanding the mechanisms behind systemic organizational misbehavior. In this episode, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Guido Palazzo. Professor Guido is a globally recognized expert on why unethical behavior occurs in organizations. His latest book, Hidden Patterns, explores the dark dynamics that could even cause good people to make bad decisions at work. Now, this episode is vital listening for anyone listening in leadership, HR, OD, because unethical behavior can occur in any organization. Guido is a professor of business ethics at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland and a globally recognized voice. His research spans corporate misconduct, ethical blindness, and the moral complexity of being in a modern organization. He's advised global companies, spoken at the World Economic Forum, and published in top academic journals. And he's also delivered programs to thousands of leaders across the world to sensitize them to what patterns and help them to promote a climate of integrity in their own organizations. His work has naturally been recognized with the Max Weber Award for Business Ethics, but what really comes out from having read his book is a burning passion to shine a light on the dark side of human behavior and fight the good fight on our behalf. So thank you so much for joining us today, Guido. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us. What inspired you to write the book? Why now? Why did you feel sort of so motivated to write a book at this particular moment?
Well, I'm analyzing corporate scandals since many, many years, and I have always been shocked by something that we normally don't see when we read about the scandals in the news. Take the Dieselgate, take the Boeing crashes, take the Theranos startup scandal. What we normally don't read, what we see is the surface of some illegal practices done by engineers or by salespeople or by whomever. What we don't see is this immense human suffering that is happening in the background. People who get burned out, whose life gets destroyed, who often kill themselves. This is, in a way, one of the driving forces for me to share these stories, to point at the price we pay, the human price we pay when we engage in this kind of destructive, toxic behavior and create such organizational conditions for people in which they break.
I guess when someone commits to reading it, and it is a really good book, Danny and I have both read it at length, and obviously for those watching it, it's just me today. Danny unfortunately has got COVID, so we wish her well and hope that she's back as soon as possible. We've had lots of conversations about this over the last 3 weeks as I've been reading it. And as you were writing it, what did you hope that readers take away from the book?
Well, this book is not written out of the blue. I have done for many, many years workshops with companies, with leaders in companies on the dark pattern, the topic of the book. What I hope for is pretty much the same that I hope for when I do these workshops. I hope people as leaders realize that sometimes, even against their own intention, they can push their teams into behaviors that are unacceptable and that they understand how this happens. Again, it's very often not intended, probably most of the time not intended. It's just they do a little bit too much of pressure they exert on their teams under normal circumstances, and then something breaks. So understanding the social psychology, the leader-follower relationship, and how that can drive people into bad behavior, that's the first reason. The second reason is that we can find ourselves on the other side as the victims of that kind of behavior, so that we are pushed into wrong behavior in our organizations. And that happens very often by a slippery slope with small steps so that we don't see it happening. Once we see it, it's often too late. So for both roles that we can potentially play in organizations, I hope that this book will help us to create a workplace with more dignity and more respect.
Yeah, and what is it about the human condition that means that we're more likely to blame character for something that happens rather than kind of looking at the individual instead of looking up at the system around it?
Well, this is a knee-jerk, very human reaction to bad things around us, whatever bad means for us, right? We assume that if something bad is done, that someone bad must have done it. So we attribute it to character. It's almost automatically done. Interestingly, when we ourselves engage in something we find problematic and we have to justify it, we often refer to context. And that might be closer to the truth, because most of the time when we do something in high pressure context, it's because of those contexts that we act, not because of who we are. It's not our values. It's not our good intentions that will protect us once the context unfolds its powerful dynamics.
And I guess one of the really good things about the book is that it kind of breaks down, doesn't it? What are some of the ingredients or building blocks upon which bad behavior or unethical behaviors are likely to? What were some of those 9 things that came from the research?
There are 9 elements that together build this dark pattern, as we call it. The first one is what we call rigid ideology. So it is in our case, mainly the neoliberal profit maximization ideology that narrows down what leaders think is their role, making as much money as possible, and let the market or society deal with the fallout of that, because it's not their role to consider ethics as an element of their decisions. We teach this in business schools since decades. So that's factor number one. And the more rigid you believe in that, the less you can see the ethical dimension, the ethical consequences of the decision. The second one is what we call toxic leadership. So leaders that represent maybe the dark triad. They are psychopaths, they are narcissists, and they're very good in playing games behind other people's backs. So they're Machiavellianists. And they create a climate of fear and obedience around them, in which you cannot speak up. The third one is what we call manipulative language. So there are certain ways of speaking in organizations that signal that unethical behavior is more probable than in other 3 types of language. The first one is war language. So you speak as if you're in a war, you have to kill the enemy, there must be bloodshed, some will survive, and so on. So you have a really violent language. The second one is cultish language. So it's very typical in startups. You are there to save humanity. You fuse the mind with a machine. So there is this transhumanism. So all these kind of very strange things. Your CEO is the Messiah, can walk over water. That's number 2. Number 3 is what we call euphemistic language game. And we know from research that if you package bad behavior in nice language, it becomes easier to enact it. If you call something creative accounting, that is much, much better than calling it tax fraud. It engage much more often. So that's number 3. Number 4 is corrupting goals. You give people goals they cannot. And here again, you have to look at the combination of these. Imagine you have this toxic leadership style. You're pushed into your goals by this aggressive language, and you know that these goals are totally unrealistic, and your boss knows it, but you cannot say it because of it. Then point number 5 is what we call destructive incentives. Incentives can have two impacts on unethical behavior. One is they can narrow down what. So if you are incentivized just to build an airplane as fast and as cheap as possible, the 2 KPIs at Boeing, well, then you build the airplane cheap. And we have seen with the 737 MAX crashes on this end. So one element is incentives narrow down your perspective. They blind you for other aspects of your decision that you should see, but you can't. And the second is that very often organizations organize incentives as a kind of hunger game. We are 10 people in the team. At the end of the year, 2 will be fired, the low performers. So who these are depends on how we perform. So we will fight the whole year not to be these 2 low performers. That's what I call the hunger games. Number 6 is ambiguous rules, which means leaders are very unclear about what the rules are. For instance, you are a high performing salesperson, and it seems that you have more rights than others. Rights, for instance, to ignore compliance rules. And the others observe that the ones who are high performing, they're protected, or they are toxic and still they are not fired because they are high performing. So you understand, okay, in my organization, there are the official rules and there are the informal rules. And you open a gray zone as a company by that, in which people start to interpret, what can I do? How far can I go? How can I get promoted? What is tolerable? And this is what we call this ambiguity that opens up in an organization. Number 7 is perceived unfairness. So if you think that you are treated unfairly by the competition, by the government, by your own superior, you feel this right to rebalance things in your own favor. And that includes breaking the rules of the game. Number 8 is dangerous groups. So all kind of group effects that reinforce the other effects in their ability to create routines in entire teams, entire organizations that are totally illegal, but people cannot see them anymore because everyone is engaging. And finally, number 9 is what we call the slippery slope. None of these things happens from one day to the other. Scandals, I mean, the Woolbright destruction of this illegal filter at Dieselgate at Volkswagen, or the fraudulent startup at Elizabeth Holmes. Nothing happens from one day to the other. It's in small steps, one moral compromise after another. And at one point, you are so fast in the slippery slope down to the dark pattern that you cannot stop this. So when all these 9 elements come together and are strong, we argue the risk, moral collapse of the organization is very high.
Yeah, it's really because as I was just reading it, I was like, ugh. A shiver went down. It's like, 'cause you do see these things out in the workplace, don't you? And it's like, and there's so much value there, and sort of picking out on some of those things, they're all really powerful. So some of the things that really sort of resonated with me was, the powerful ideology that leads the organization. Because if you talk about there being a balance as well. So for example, like if all you focus on is shareholder value, then everything else is means and ends, isn't it? And then that got me thinking about sort of organizations that maybe say they have a customer obsession. The over obsession in one thing leads to a lack of care in others. Is that something that you sort of saw, was it?
Yes, that's exactly the point. And I always tell this to my own students when I teach business ethics. Mathematically, maximization means one simple thing. It means you focus on one aspect over all the other aspects. You cannot consider other aspects if you maximize one. The opposite model would be to balance, to optimize a set of criteria or a set of stakeholders. But if you do this in a maximization style, you don't care about anything else. And the maximization of profit is as harmful as the customer obsession. Because if I'm obsessed, just the word, right? Just the word is already dangerous. If I'm obsessed about customers, I don't care about workers. And that's the Amazon story.
Yeah, and then there was another one you mentioned as well, the power and the precision of language as well, because you talked about language and how it's used, and there was an example that you pulled out, which was about some experiments that were done, and participants took part in a game. One game was framed up as the Wall Street game, and then the same game, and people approached it in a certain way, and another game was the same game was called the community game. What was about that? What surfaced for you in that episode?
For me, this is a fascinating experiment because it shows that by just changing one word in a social setting, you create a completely different type of behavior in groups. If you tell people to play a game where they can win by either competing or collaborating, and you tell them the game's name is Wall Street, they will fight. If you tell another group of people, giving them exactly the same explanation of the game, you can compete and collaborate, both leads to victory potential. The same rules, the same explanation, word by word, but you call it community game, they will tend to collaborate. And I always tell leaders when I do trainings, you look at this story, this experiment, what you see is that you as a leader, by the words that you use, you pre-frame the world for your team. They will make sense of their jobs, their decisions, through the language that you use. Again, coming back to the war language, if you frame everything as a war against competitors, do not be surprised if they behave and engage in behavior that they think is justified because there's a war.
And you start to touch on some of like the big societal narratives as well, don't you? Because obviously, like baked into that is a belief that competition is good, and you talk about Darwinism and survival of the fittest, the fastest, the strongest, whatever. But you sort of contrast with it. Well, actually, the human species has actually developed well because we're actually collaborative beyond all measure, and we can achieve far more as a group than we can as any individual. So we are kind of battling at much bigger narratives than any organization as well. We also have to be countercultural, don't we?
I mean, how would you imagine to build a cathedral or an airplane if we would constantly fight? The human species, of course, we do both. We fight and we collaborate. But we are by default, and we know this from research in psychology, anthropology, even by biologists, that we are by default a collaborative species. But what we teach in business school is fighting, competition, social Darwin. You must crush the competition. You are surrounded by enemies. That's the Michael Porter approach. 5 forces around you. They're all your enemies. You must win against them and keep them away because they want something from you. So if you see the world through the lens of competition, and you teach that and you send people out into the world as managers, well, they will. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Imagine we would teach collaboration. You would get probably a very different type of organization.
Yeah, and you touched on things like how we teach, and there's the MBA programs and the business programs around the world. How many of them actually have ethics embedded into them? Because it's a huge time to shape people's beliefs, isn't it? And you are throwing all the strategic stuff at you, isn't it? It's really about how do you guide people to make their own mind up about their own approach.
It probably has, well, the key message that I always give to my students in the MBA class, for instance, is that ethics is not just another course next to your strategy course or your whatever course, tax course. It's the foundations. And you should critically ask questions to all your other professors about the things they say about maximization, about free markets that regulate themselves, about governance you have to create because you cannot trust people. All these silent elements of an ideology that we have implemented in our teaching, in our theories over the last decades, since Milton Friedman came up with his ideas on shareholder value maximization, that we should critically challenge, because they are probably the reason why our society is in trouble. Include the scandals, but you can also include ecological crisis, the social cohesion that falls apart. It's all about this individual-based, competition-based, free market-based understanding of society.
And there was one particular burning question that I had sort of throughout the book, which is, how do we decide what is ethical and what is not? You're a professor of business ethics, but and obviously we have our own ethical compass that they carry with us, but ethics evolve over time, don't they? The kind of ethics that drove organizational behavior and organizational principles back in the early 1900s are very different to now. And those people back then felt very sure and certain that what they were doing was ethical, but that doesn't always sort of age so well, does it?
Until the late 1990s, you could deduce bribes in other countries from tax, in Germany and in other countries. So it was considered a normal business practice. I remember a time when I was a child where smoking was considered not a moral issue. My father was smoking in the car with three little boys, one cigarette after another. Today that will not be possible. So there are processes, as you say, where morality evolves, where we think something is unacceptable that was okay yesterday, and vice versa. So that's not stable. On the other side, there are some core elements of morality. We probably would all agree that it's not good to push your team member into suicide. We probably would all agree it's not good to have child labor in your supply chain. And if people tell me, well, but that's their culture, then my question back is always, tell me which culture considers it as a value that children kill themselves through work in a mine. That culture doesn't exist. It's very often a question of options that don't exist, but not of normative positions in one culture or another. So we have some core elements that we would agree on. But when we develop this idea of what we call ethical blindness, so this effect that you do wrong things but you cannot see it anymore, which is the result of the dark pattern. The context pushes you into a routine that over time you lose the ability to see the warning signals. You think what you do is okay. So this ethical blindness, when we defined it, we said this is not about some external definition by someone about ethics. This is you, your own values, your own ideas about what is right and wrong. That is what you cannot see anymore. So you take doping, for instance, as a cyclist, and you think that's okay. But then 10 years later, when you look back at your life, you think, how could I do this? I feel ashamed. That's what we mean. Or you take the bribe, or you behave like a horrible, toxic terror regime leader in your team, and you get blamed afterwards by what you did. So this is what we mean. You act against your own values and you cannot see this.
And yeah, and that's that kind of sort of slippery slope element, wasn't it? I think you sort of identified that a lot of the people that, a lot of the examples, some of them end up in court, and, before they would have known that it was an offence or it was unethical, and after they knew it was unethical, but in the moment, with all those contextual factors at play, that ethical blindness or willful blindness was kind of quite prevalent, wasn't it?
Yes, and in some cases, even more tricky thing. Put yourself in the shoes of Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos. So she claimed she had this miraculous blood testing machine that would just put a drop of blood from your fingertip and would do 250 tests. So without pain, almost without costs. And you can do this every day. And you understand whether you are sick, cancer, for instance, much earlier than under normal circumstances. So this would revolutionize healthcare. There was research in that direction of how to do that. It's not invented out of nothing. There is serious research on engineers who work on making things smaller. So she starts to develop this. And in this process, she has some success with her team, but not much. So she pushes them to work harder and more, day and night, to get more success. It's this fake it till you make it situation, right? So there is no clear right and wrong in most of these moments where you decide to push harder because you believe in it. To say, well, there is one moment where it turns into fraud is not so easy. Even if you lie to your customers, you overpromise something, you still do this like anyone else does it in Silicon Valley with the hope that once you sell it, it will be ready. Steve Jobs was doing it. So what is the point where we could say Holmes does something profoundly unethical, and where would we say, and until that point, she does what everyone does in the industry, only with the difference that she has a healthcare product and not just a software. Then you are praised by everyone around you as the new Steve Jobs. You lose sight of reality.
Then you're projected into a role that you can't get off of then, aren't you? It brought back a lot of personal experiences for me, something that was really deeply uncomfortable. You talk about rank and yank, which we have a lot to thank the 1980s for, with sort of really iconic leaders at the time that we looked up to and said, this is how it should be done, like Jack Welch, for example, where you basically rank an organization. It's often 20, 70, 10, isn't it? That 10 is consequences happen to them as well. And I was in the middle of it. I started working with a new client, and my first day on site was the actual announcement of the statistics, and everybody was in the room together and the 10 were identified. And it's quite something, isn't it, when it happens? But it does this particular thing. And even though not all performance management systems will be quite as open about something like that, they all do a thing, don't they?
They devastate humans and they destroy collaboration and the cohesion, the culture of an organization. The inventor of that is probably not Jack Welch, but some unknown Roman general who would, in order to punish his army, just randomly kill 10% of the soldiers, right? So that the others would obey better. Decimation comes from that practice. And Jack Welch just applied this to companies by saying, well, in any company there are low performers. He called that dead wood. And you can know the language again, dead wood, devoid of dignity. The words already are. And he said, well, in any company there are these 10, 20% low performers, and he wanted them to be out. And that's why his managers had to buy the Gauss curve. And from then on, it became the fashion. The sad, the absurd thing about this is that research in human resource management has found that this performance in organizations does not distribute along a Gauss curve. It's much simpler. You have some star performers, and the rest is more or less comparable with a few outliers. But if you believe in the Gauss curve and you invent tools to measure it, then you find, of course, the 20% low performers, and you fire them once per year. At Enron, twice per year. And again, we know in the long run it destroys everything because people have fear. They will break rules. They will harass each other. They will not collaborate. There's all kinds of negative effects. We know this, and organizations keep doing it. Think about Meta, Zuckerberg, who recently announced he wants more masculine energy in the company, and the way he does it is firing 5% of the people. And you can see their comments, the people who were fired on LinkedIn, where they say, well, I was always getting the best evaluations, and suddenly I'm a low performer. Maybe because I'm a young woman with 2 children. So you see, it fires back. It makes people bitter. Not only those who survive, who are fired, but also the ones who survive. Because you can be the one who is fired next time. And as you mentioned, this is a very humiliating process. You don't want to go through this. And how do you explain this to your next employer that you are low performer? So it's a very dangerous tool, probably the most toxic tool ever used in human resource management.
You know, the universities like your own develop brilliant research that kind of sort of tears or disrupts these myths that pervade corporate reality, you know, that performance goes along a curve, all those different types of things as well. Why do so many of these myths pervade organizations, and why do they still live on far beyond wherever they should?
First of all, if certain practices have taken root, it's very difficult to get rid of them. Take incentives. There's also plenty of research showing that the best way to motivate people is to give them a good working environment and pay a fair salary. Bonuses don't do that job, don't lead to higher performance. So if we would stop with the bonuses, we would probably have more performance. People would just consider their working conditions fair and respectful. But try to reduce or get rid of bonuses in an organization. Will fight back. So it's very difficult. get rid of practice. The Gauss curve is very tempting for managers because it gives them a tool where they can show I do something, I act, I get results, I fire people if they don't perform. So and probably many people believe that this is motivating. They have gone through the same themselves and they have become, I don't know, CEO. And now they say, well, look, I became CEO in this world, so this works, and now I want the others to do the same. I mean, the people who implemented this at Enron, they all came from McKinsey. And McKinsey, of course, when they do this, this is a very different game. You can rank and yank elite people because then you send them to other organizations where they get into top jobs and they become one who would give you projects, right? So that's a very different game. But try this with salespeople who earn low salaries at Wells Fargo. Try this with technicians at a telecommunication company, and what you get is suicide or fraud, because people will struggle to survive. Cannot do this with everybody in the organization.
Yeah, and the power of these things when they come together are quite something, aren't they? Because they guide employee behaviour even when no one else is watching. Like it's a form of surveillance almost, isn't it? And when you talked about, well, there's one particular example that's quite disturbing, which is about Wells Fargo, where it's actually, you know, unethical behaviour on an industrial scale, like 100,000 employees, 3.5 million false bank accounts opened. It just shows, doesn't it, the scale. Was that one of the examples that surprised you the most?
I would say it surprised me. None of these things surprised me because the more you read on scandals, the less you're surprised. But what it does is it gives me the best example for the argument that scandals are not about some bad people at the top of the company as they are presented in documentaries on Netflix. 100,000 salespeople committing fraud. You cannot explain this by calculus unless you have an HR department that is specialized in hiring only crooks, which I don't think is the case. Or people who are crooks think, well, I have to work at Wells Fargo because that's where I can live my fullest life as a crook. No, that is not what drives it. What drives it is situations that are so desperate, there's so much pressure that one of my favorite quotes from a salesperson at Wells Fargo, so much pressure that one of them later on, I have been in the Gulf War. So he was a veteran soldier, and Wells Fargo was worse than the Gulf War. So imagine that. We have people who say, well, I couldn't sleep on Sunday, or couldn't sleep at night by thinking about the next day's shift, or was hiding in the men's bathroom crying, or someone says, I was achieving my goals, but then they were never satisfied. I have to do more and more and more. So you're always running behind your goals. You get humiliated by your superior. You are fired if you don't achieve your goal. They yell at you. So it's a horrible, horrible situation. You do what it takes to survive. And then you observe your colleagues doing it. And they get promoted, and their behavior get tolerated. Their leaders push them to do it. And then you think, yeah, well, if they all can do that, why not? And then everyone does it. And the same say about the doping scandal of Lance Armstrong in Tour de France, where almost everyone was taking drug to enhance their performance. So you create context where everyone participates, and then everyone thinks, well, what we do is normal, it's okay.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on something really, really important there, isn't it? Which is you talk about one of the things, which is like, you know, the ambiguity, and there's so many organisations with values and they're espoused, and let's be honest, a lot of them are bullshit, aren't they? In terms of what they say and the guidance they should give. Yet you're seeing people being promoted for exhibiting opposite behaviours as well. Does that mean that values are defunct in organisations? They're not worthwhile, or how can we actually get them to start really be meaningful and significant and to guide decisions? Because they're really difficult decisions as well.
Yes, not normally companies define values because everyone has values, and therefore they have to have values too. So they have maybe a marketing agency giving them 5 values, or 10, or 7, whatever. But that is not values. Values means 2 things. First of all, leaders have to use them in their decisions. They have to show to their teams that these values are what he or she is basing their decisions on. And second, they have to talk about this with their team. They have to engage them in ethical conversations to signal the importance of the values. You have to walk the talk and talk the walk. And if you don't do these 2 things, you can have the most beautiful, Enron had the most beautiful values you can imagine. Boeing had great values. Volkswagen, but this is completely useless if you do not use them in daily decisions as leaders.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarises all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback.
And shifting gears, obviously we've sort of painted a picture of the reasons why and like how do you start, and you talk about the bright pattern. But I guess before we sort of move into that area, one of the ways in which a lot of these scandals come about is because someone or some people blow the whistle. And often for the person, they are doing something out of integrity or a variety of different reasons. But often what happens to them as a result is often, I guess, what did your research sort of find out about the people that did sort of try to stop these things as they were happening?
It's interesting, if you look into these stories, there's always at least someone who speaks up. So I make the difference between whistleblowing and speaking up. Speaking up means you say internally to your superiors, what we do is wrong, or what you want me to do is against the code of conduct, or whatever. You talk about this in your hierarchy. And this happens in all these scandals. At one point, some people stand up and go to their superiors and say, there's a problem. And then they get pushed back, they get harassed, they get threatened, they get fired. And the others observe that. So who would want to speak up next? That is what happens to those. So you create a culture of silence that is also already driven by this toxic culture that I mentioned as one of the building. Think about Volkswagen's CEO Winterkorn told his team that they had no problems because a problem doesn't exist at Volkswagen. If you have a problem, you are a problem with your fight. This culture, where you don't have a problem, is you hide problems and you try to find solutions. It's the most stupid thing that leaders can say to their teams. You don't come to me with a problem. The second most stupid thing is come to me only with solutions. Because if I have a problem, I see it. We have to do something. I know not what to do about it. Then I will not say it. Problems must be articulated. And in a culture, the one that these companies that we investigated developed, don't make it possible. And that is when some people are courageous enough and go outside and talk about this to the authorities, to the media, and make it public, the whistleblowers. And that is not what you want as an organization, because this can be very, very expensive.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And I guess looking at the bright patterns, because you're in the domain of culture change, aren't you? And that is a huge start to shift cultural norms. Is it only the CEO that can start to make change, or can change only happen once the CEO goes, or does that not even make a difference because it's so endemic that one person leaving won't make the difference?
But if you look at the Boeing story, for instance, where years after the 2 crashes of the 737 MAX, suddenly a door falls from the sky. And then when you read the news, you find the same challenges described that were discussed during the crashes of the 2 737 MAXs before. Culture of silence, pressure on costs, pressure on speed. People who speak up are threatened. So it's the same thing. So they are not able, or maybe not willing, to reflect upon their culture and to change it. What it signals to me is always, well, it's very easy to destroy a culture top down. It's so difficult to grow it back. It will take years before people speak up after a fallout. But why would they? They sit and wait. They have seen what happens in the past when you speak up. And now they wait. What happens if someone else does it? Will again something bad happen? So it takes years before they will trust again. So you destroy it from the top, but you also have to recreate it from the top. But then you have to, as I said, you have to engage in ethics. You have to engage in moral conversations. You have, as a leader, to think about ethics as a key element of your job. And I know very few top managers doing that. If you're the new CEO coming in after a scandal, your job is to look forward, clean up the mess fast enough, and then look forward. Don't talk about these things anymore. You have not been involved anyway. You don't want to be connected to it. You are here to prove that you can turn around the company. We don't talk about what happened. And that's the biggest mistake already. right from the start of the chapter.
Because in there, all the lessons learned, aren't they? All those moments where people saw something, were on the slippery slope almost. You talk about something which I thought was a great concept, which is to develop options and to introduce some agency and choice. And because again, you talked about dialogue, and dialogue is one of the key, I imagine, key levers for starting to reverse or start to shift the patterns that you see as well. What role do options play, and how can people bring options into discussions to start navigating the moral maze a little bit easier?
I think the first aspect here is that we as individuals, we need to have options. If I would be fired tomorrow, I would have 3, 4, 5 ideas about what to do next. Would not be nice, would be totally unpleasant, but I would have ideas about what to do next. And you look into these scandals, people who are involved, and when they are asked afterwards why they participate, very often the answer is, I thought I had no choice. Which means they saw no other option for themselves than participate. If I have an idea about an alternative career, if I have some other skills I can do in the A or whatever to make my skill set larger. When I have options, I'm free because no one can force me to a behavior when I can leave and walk away from an organization. But walking away is not possible when you think this job, this career, this life here, that's all I have. Because without that, I'm nobody. Develop options makes you free, and it makes entire organization, if people do that, much more flexible. Because you're not scared away from saying things you want to say anymore.
There are other ways that organizations do to sort of limit people's options, aren't they?
Yeah, but that's a different type of option, right? This is, you get incentives to do what you do. You get money, you get gifts, you get lavish working conditions. That's not what I mean as options is, what do I do with my life? Who am I? That is options. If I can give you 2 answers. So I'm a professor now, but I could also be a corporate trainer. I could be a book writer. I could be many things. That is liberating. Do not need this job to be someone. That is the point.
Which is really interesting, because we're at the role of identity then, aren't we?
Yes.
A person like me does a thing like this. In a way, the more people work, the harder they work, the more they're committed, the more hours they do, the less of a life that they have outside of work. So their world kind of closes in a little bit. Also add time pressure as well, and people's worlds get smaller. So you can start to see how people's options start to reduce quite significantly, can't you?
It's often the intention by the company not to let you go home. So you can do the shopping, the sports, and everything on the compound of the company. Because the longer you stay, the more you work. But the more you work in this one company, the less you have a life. And the less you have a life, the less you can think and reflect upon yourself. What you want. And that is not very healthy mentally, physically, to be in that kind of situation.
Interesting. And part of that bright pattern, there was a really wonderful example that you talked around, which is in Sicily, where a group of young students actually started to challenge the way in which sort of the mafia operates within the community there as well. What was that story?
Well, in Sicily, like in many other places where the mafia rules, shop owners pay protection money, the racket. And whenever people tried to change that, they were killed. The shops were burned down and so on. So refusing to pay it or fighting against it was a life-terminating move. Until there was a group of young people in the 90s and developed an approach where they convinced hundreds of shop owners to not pay the bribe anymore. To put a label out in the window, say, I am not paying the bribe. So addio pizzo. Pizzo is the Italian word for racket. So farewell racket. And they convinced thousands of customers to commit to buy, especially in those shops. Because the biggest fear, if you do the right thing, is you do it alone. And no one helps you. You are isolated. In the very moment where these young people could show the shop owners and the shoppers, you're not alone. There are thousands. They were willing to participate. And this whole process was driven by values. So you take the values of the people and you talk about dignity, which is a strong Italian Sicilian value, and you turn the meaning of the value around by connecting it to this anti-mafia activity. So a huge success story, and the mafia cannot kill hundreds of shop owners. So they were not able to react to that. Very powerful story of change. Change can happen even in situations where it never happened for hundreds of years. Still it can happen. We just have to do it the right way. And a very powerful way of changing society, changing an organization is to via the value.
So the values that we talked about earlier, which is often an organization's biggest weakness because it shows to employees every single day that they mean nothing, actually, if you use them well, can mean everything and are actually a potential tool to create that culture change that you're looking to create.
But managers never learned this. And they are told in business schools, that's not your job. Focus on shareholder value. Ethics, as Milton Friedman once wrote, is for your private life. You separate this. And if you separate this, and if you think managers don't do these things, and if I do it, I'm considered a weak manager, you don't engage in ethics. And you don't have the toolbox anyway, because we're never taught. So that is where we have to change. And that change would be very powerful.
And while you're writing this book, you're constantly researching, some of the darker elements of organizations. Like, how do you keep yourself kind of resourced and with a sense of agency and a sense of hope that things can change?
Desmond Tutu once said, I'm a prisoner of hope. So I'm not getting pessimistic if I see these things, because I also see positive change happening. I see individuals standing up. I see people using values. I see organizations having ethical culture. So it's not that we are bad as human beings. It's that we just need to change the conditions in a way that we can also show the better side of us. So that makes me, what's the alternative to hope? Cynicism.
And as you're sort of looking at what kind of emerging trends or topics are catching your attention right now? What are you starting to see? You're exposed to a huge number of leaders and organizations. Like what's catching your attention?
Well, I'm always asked when I do my workshops with companies, who's next? So if you have this dark pattern and you see these warning signals, where would you see the next scandal emerging? And over the last years, I always had one name that I mentioned when I was asked that question, and that was Elon Musk, Tesla, or any other company, because you can Google it. You can Google the dark pattern for any of his companies. Toxic leadership, the unachievable goals, the aggressive language, the ambiguous rules. Rule breaking is normalized. And so it's all there. I don't say this anymore because if you as a CEO can control the regulator and destroy it, then there is no investigation. So I think he's fine. No scandal. I now look more and more into the AI, the crypto industry, because that's where typically scandals start. They start in domains where there is a hype, where people claim they change the rules of everything. Where you can make a lot of money and where the rules are totally unclear. And that is these two domains. Like Enron, the internet, the early days of the internet in the 2000s, Enron and WorldCom and the others, it's the same situation. The rules are unclear. You are considering yourself as kind of messiah, and then you move forward. You do whatever you want. That will lead. So it does lead to scandals already. We saw FTX. We saw some other cases recently. So I would not be surprised if we see serious scandals in AI, crypto in the next years. So I'm looking forward to that. I need new stories.
I think there's many coming down the pipe for that one, unfortunately. Yeah. And again, part of that is framing. Like if you think about how internally organizations are rolling out AI in their organizations, the framing really matters about how it's done, doesn't it?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
So reflecting on your work so far, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned along the way?
The biggest lesson that I learned is that nobody of us, including myself, can say we wouldn't do it. Nobody. Some of us would not participate in these things, but most of us would under certain circumstances. And that should make us all humble about ourselves, that we potentially can be harassers, fraudsters, pay bribes, and not feel anything about it. So we should be aware of that and protect ourselves. I mentioned the options. The options is one thing. If you have options in life, quite protect. But to develop the options, you need to know who you are. What are your values? Where do you want to go with your life? What are thresholds where you would say, I would not go beyond that? So if they ask me to go further, I say no. And here is the sentences that I prepared for my superior in case they will ask me to go further. So what's the threshold? What's the point where I would say no? Because you see that people who get out of these horrible contexts very often see something the others do not see anymore. They see an end point. And that is normally not something good. And they stop and they get out. They leave the company or they speak up.
And you've actually preempted one of our last questions there, which is what advice would you give to someone who's just starting to be more aware that ethics is a huge part of what they need to be aware of in the organization? There's those things. Is there anything else that you would encourage someone who's just taken those first steps or maybe starting to notice practices around them that are starting to tick off some of those building blocks of the 9 that you noticed?
Well, there's one thing that I would consider very important and that is normally not discussed so much. In all these scandals, the people who are either the ones who speak up or the ones who get arrested, they are alone. No one supports them. On the contrary, people take side of their leaders. Think about the scandal of Telecom, where a horrible change management process pushed 100 people into suicide in 3.5 years. But when the people targeted by their leaders were collapsing on their desk, their colleagues left the room and worked somewhere else. They stopped speaking with them. And they had even a name for them, the sans-chairs, so the people without a chair. You are alone. And that is the bystander effect. We don't want to be the first who helps. We don't want to be the first who sticks out. So we wait for someone else to speak up. And no one does. So I'm alone. Be an ally. That's a very important thing. And if you want to speak up, if you need help, ask colleagues to be allies. And many people, surprisingly many people, will be willing to be an ally, but they need to be prepared mentally. And they need to be prepared what they say, what they do when the moment comes. If it's happening spontaneously, they will not help. Organizations must create a climate of allyship. That is a key element of how you avoid these toxic contexts.
That's really powerful. And we're going to make sure that gets put in a clip and sent out to as many people as possible, because I think it's just such an important fundamental bit of work that we all need to do. And a lot of the people that are watching this are practitioners, and we talk about the importance of reflection. And those are kind of questions that we need to reflect on and know about ourselves, so that when we're in the cut and thrust of the culture, we're standing on solid ground as well. Guido, we just want to say a huge thank you for all the work that you're doing and for putting yourself in the place where you do the research so that others can sort of have that awareness as well. If people want to reach out to you, if they want to follow your work, we've consumed your book. You can buy the book. We love the fact it was on Audiobook, and it's just a great experience, just a real, because we're only just touching the tip of the iceberg of the contents of the book as well. We just touched on the sort of the key themes, but in the book is so much depth and real tactics and challenging questions to ask ourselves as well. What's the best way for people to follow you?
Well, the best way would be to connect on LinkedIn, where I discuss these things regularly. Not always to the pleasure of everybody, but that's just the beauty of good discussions. I think connect on LinkedIn would be the best way. And the book can be bought anywhere in Europe, in any bookshop.
Fantastic. We'll make sure that all the links are in the show notes as well. So we do really recommend you to read and access Guido's book, whether it's on audiobook or paperback as well. We've loved it. It's been such a good thing. Danny just is so gutted she couldn't make it today because she had so many questions, but I hope I've answered as many of her questions you wanted as well. There's so many things that stood out for me. I think some of the principles that we need to be mindful of are, the slippery slope, just that it's happening, and it doesn't, a crisis just doesn't suddenly happen, does it? It just sort of slowly happens step by step. The power of, the ideology, and, if you are joining an organization that has a strong ideology, what does that mean and what's the impact as well? But also really importantly, the reflection that you need to do for yourself to make sure that you are aware of where your red lines and where your ethics sit as well. So thank you so much, Guido. We love it. It's been brilliant. It's been a great conversation. I know that loads of people are going to get so much enjoyment out of it. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Gary.